Hello and welcome to episode 226 of the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. My name is Aidan Muir and I'm here with my co-host Torwen Eerkens, and we are going to be talking about whether it is possible to boost metabolism. And we're going to try and do this in the simplest way possible. One of the things we're going to do as a starting point is probably just define what we are referring to when we're talking about metabolism.
I think that's a great place to start. So metabolism is the process in which your body converts what you eat and drink to energy. So if we look at that from a bigger picture, we know that your body burns calories, a measure of energy, all the time, even at rest, which is what we call your resting metabolic rate. Now, this encompasses all your vital functions, breathing, circulation, any sort of other small resting movements as well. And this is actually not a set number and it can change, which is what we will get to. So if we look at the total amount of energy that you expend in the day then, so your total daily energy expenditure, this comes from your resting metabolic rate, an activity factor, your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, and also the thermic effect of food.
And I think that means we're going to be talking about a bit of both because it's pretty broad. So like if we were just saying metabolism, we could just leave it at resting metabolic rate. I think when people are referring to metabolism, they're often doing a bit of a combination of that and total daily energy expenditure. So I think we'll cover a bit of both. So where we're going to start in terms of boosting metabolism is our thoughts on total calorie intake, both short and long term. I think we're going to start with short term stuff. And clearly, short term calorie intake can impact things in either direction. The short version is if you eat more calories, it probably increases your energy expenditure or probably increases your metabolism. If you decrease your calories, it probably decreases it a little bit.
Yeah, and this is what we call metabolic adaptation in a sense as well. So potentially where we look at the physiological response of the body making that adjustment to either reducing calories or eating more. So adapting that compared to what you're giving it as well.
And if we were going to break down all four of those variables you touched on earlier, with the resting metabolic rate, like that's absolutely where metabolic adaptation would come into play, where if the body has more calories available, it's going to be more able or more willing to spend those calories on some of the less super important factors. The lower your calorie intake gets, the more that it has to kind of conserve energy. And the common cliche that's chucked out there is like battery saver mode. So there are heaps of things that get down regulated. The body's core temperature might drop a little bit. Some of the hormones won't work as well. A common one with women is they might lose their period because fertility is no longer a priority if you don't have enough calories coming in to even just sustain yourself. Heaps of stuff going on there. Going on to other stuff like the incidental movement, like people will often move a little bit less. Some of that is less willingness to move due to being less energetic, and other stuff is more incidental in terms of people just fidgeting less and stuff like that. People's step count, if they're not actively tracking it, will naturally decrease in many cases. Exercise, people might burn less calories through exercise, partly even just due to doing less exercise if they have fewer calories coming in. And then the thermic effect of food, I think this is the easiest one. We burn calories in the process of eating and digesting food. If we eat more, we'll burn more calories through that process. If we eat less, we'll burn less calories through that process.
Yeah. Do we want to run through some studies that kind of explain what we've just talked about there in terms of metabolic adaptation, specifically in longer term situations? And the biggest one that people often reference in this situation is the Biggest Loser study, which had a look at participants which were on the Biggest Loser show who did lose a significant amount of weight. And their resting metabolic rate dropped significantly during this time. 6 years later, they had regained a lot of the weight, but their resting metabolic rate remained suppressed, like about 500 calories per day lower than what was predicted.
Yeah, and this one, I've spoken about heaps on the podcast, and it stands out heaps. It was actually pretty formative for me, like early in my career as a dietitian, because there was a lot of people who were talking about how yo-yo dieting and a few things like this are very detrimental to long-term metabolism and why we would need specific strategies to offset that. But the more and more research that has come out on this topic, the more it seems like that one is a huge outlier of a study. And there's many reasons it could be an outlier. One is that it is very extreme. The protocol was extreme. The thing that makes me think it's less about the extreme protocol outside of the exercise component is that bariatric surgery, I don't know if have you seen much on bariatric surgery and metabolism stuff?
Not a whole lot, actually.
So I had questions on this for a very long time in my own mind. I'm sure you've experienced this as well, where anecdotally, myself and every dietitian comes across a lot of clients who are reporting being on quite low calories and not losing weight. I'm sure you've seen heaps, yeah?
Yeah.
And I see that more in the bariatric surgery space than anywhere else. And it made me wonder, being like, what does the research show on people who've had bariatric surgery? And I've put some studies in the show notes on this. Basically, the finding is that there isn't a difference versus what you would expect from a metabolic rate if you just used a prediction. There's actually one study in there where 6 months after surgery, there was a small increase in resting metabolic rate in comparison to what you would expect based on their body weight adjusted. So it's not like they had an increase from where they started because they had lost heaps of weight, but it's an increase in comparison to what a formula would have predicted, which to me is actually pretty odd because they actually have lost so much weight and they're probably still losing weight. I won't go too deep into that, but there's enough for me to be like, even with like large weight losses, we're not seeing heaps of this, which then comes back to the Biggest Loser one. That study has been reinterpreted, and one of the biggest things that, and I'm not sure I fully agree with this, but one of the biggest things that was pointed to by Kevin Hall, who was the one who did research, is a lot of the participants in that study to this day are still doing heaps of exercise. And if we do heaps of exercise, our body can potentially downregulate in certain other areas, including our resting metabolic rate. And that was one of the explanations. Their resting metabolic rate was reduced by 500 calories. I don't know if that would account, like if just exercise accounts for that much of a drop, but we have a combination of so many variables of it being a pretty extreme study and them also doing a lot of exercise to this day, which if we have one study over here showing one thing and then all the other studies, which we'll talk more about, showing another thing, I'll start to lean more towards the other studies.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, this is an extreme. Like they have entered an extreme calorie deficit for quite a long period of time. They have increased exercise to an extreme as well. So potentially the results don't show accurately to other people who are doing a much more modest calorie deficit or trying to lose weight over a much longer period of time. One of the other studies that kind of goes against this then and challenges that is, it's titled Metabolic Adaptation is an Illusion. And it shows that the metabolic adaptation, so this up or down regulation of your metabolism, as we would say, depends on energy balance, and that it kind of reduces as soon as your weight stabilizes again.
Yeah, so in that study, it was 4 weeks after they finished the fat loss phase. So they'd been at maintenance for 4 weeks and they remeasured and there was no difference in their metabolic adaptation. And this is a pretty common finding, and I kind of term this, the body cares a lot more about what we've done recently than what we did a long time ago, which is very fortunate. And the broad research on metabolic adaptation really does show this. That one study you could potentially point out and be like, oh, maybe like they didn't lose heaps of weight or whatever. My interpretation is for larger weight losses or more severe calorie deficit, it might take a little bit longer, but I just don't think it takes that much longer from what I have seen, which I view as a very positive thing because back when the Biggest Loser study thing was like the main thing everyone was pointing to, I was like, damn, it kind of sucks that what we did 5 years ago could, quote unquote, like destroy our metabolism today. The rest of the research is way more positive. It's like, oh no, like what we're doing now matters so much more than what we did back then.
And just weaving into that as well, the reason people often talk about metabolism, wanting to up their metabolism, is weight. And in that same study, so that difference in or change in metabolic adaptation did not predict any sort of weight regain a year after the follow-up. So that's positive too. That's, yeah, to say that a calorie deficit, a modest one, does work. You're not affecting your resting metabolic rate longer term, which is a positive thing too.
Yeah, and even in the Biggest Loser study as well, like that was a common finding that the people who had maintained the most weight loss were the ones who were the most metabolically adapted. But that also lines up with the ones who are doing the most exercise are the ones who are most likely to maintain their weight loss as well. But it's good to see that as well. So that's exciting. So that kind of leads into our thoughts on other strategies around things like reverse dieting. I don't know if it's as common these days. It used to be way more common, but have you had any clients talking about reverse dieting before?
Somewhat. I think I work less in the weight loss space alone, but yeah, as in talking about how do I get myself back out of this calorie deficit and slowly increase calories.
Yeah, and the logic I would say for reverse dieting is that if somebody was metabolically adapted in one direction and they wanted to fix that, potentially like slowly increasing calories over time rather than one big jump, theoretically they would be able to increase their calorie intake. There's a lot of case studies out there where people add like 100 calories per week for an extended period of time and then end up on surprisingly high calories without gaining weight. A few thoughts here. One, theoretically, to reverse metabolic adaptation quicker, you could just jump straight to high calories. You don't need to go like 100 at a time. Two, I think the case studies are a little misleading because often people are still in a deficit at the start of the reverse dieting, so they're actually getting leaner at the start, and they're in almost all cases in a surplus at the end, but they're ending at the same weight, and it looks like they're at maintenance calories, but they actually are in a surplus at the end. So they haven't boosted their metabolism by 500 plus calories, like they've actually just ended up in a surplus. And then three, all of this research on metabolic adaptation kind of makes it clear that it doesn't need to be this like slow journey. And another perspective I heard somebody say on a podcast quite a few years ago that kind of just stuck with me because it really lines up with the research is, say you put all this work into building your metabolism through an approach like this, within 4 weeks back in a deficit, you're already metabolically adapted in the other direction anyway. So
maybe it doesn't make sense to take it slower when you are concerned about that and you're wanting to increase it again. Yeah. So
the only exception I'd say is if I was working with somebody in practice who had historically struggled with coming out of a deficit and overshooting, I would consider just like going a bit slower with a process like this as well.
Yeah, and I guess that leads into our thoughts on yo-yo dieting, or going from very low, maybe back up to maintenance, or even higher, like up and down, whether that's intentionally or unintentionally. Because like we've just been saying, your body does adapt to this, and depending on how long you're taking between lows and highs, that can make a big difference. But we know that when you're in that calorie or quite significant calorie deficit, thermic effect of food decreases, your like energy expenditure, exercise expenditure you just said, as well as like steps or non-exercise activity, all decreases. And this can almost lead to an increased hunger or a strong reward value for food. That can make it a lot harder to maintain the weight. So generally, yo-yo dieting is not something that we recommend.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I've thought about this a bit with like, say, like in the bodybuilding space, there is a bit of like bulking and cutting. But even that I wouldn't put into the category of yo-yo dieting, because like the bulking should be done with like a very, very small calorie surplus done for a really long time in many cases. And then the cut is a bit of a shorter time frame or whatever, but it's just so controlled, whereas yo-yo dieting is usually like a bit extreme in either direction. It's never like a small calorie surplus. It's usually a large one. But something I am obviously massive on is if somebody's had a history of yo-yo dieting, I absolutely love to get a phase in there at maintenance calories or slightly below or slightly above or whatever, just like somewhere in that range for an extended period of time. We even see this because we have the RMR testing equipment at Ideal Nutrition as well. And we will see people who will have like a suppressed metabolism who have a history of that. There's a lot of variables going on. It's hard to say, did that cause that or whatever? But in all of those cases, I would spend a period of time at maintenance, and like we do see it go up after that as well.
And that's also for a few reasons as well. I think having that diet break, especially if you're working with someone who wants to lose a larger body mass over a longer period of time, mentally, that can be a really good thing. Obviously, as we're talking about now for metabolism, it can be a good thing, but it can also be a good thing for things like hormones and just general appetite and hunger levels in general.
Now we'll talk about a more practical thing, like what can we do outside of just calories? Like what can we do? What foods can help? I don't know if we'll have the same list here. I've got 3 things on my list. And this is, it's almost like novel strategies, and we'll talk about where we actually use this. So I've got chili/capsaicin, caffeine, and then green tea/green tea extract. Have you got anything else on your list?
I've got similar there. I've also got general recommendations, which maybe we start with that and then we have a look at your more specific ones. But yeah, so just to bring it back for everyone listening. So the thermic effect of food is what we talk about, and that is the amount of energy your body uses to break down the nutrients in food. Now, this means that when you're eating certain foods or eating larger meals, like we mentioned, your thermic effect of food increases. So there are certain foods that use more energy to be broken down by the body. In general, these are things like protein. Higher fiber foods, so whole grains or vegetables, are probably the biggest groups that contribute to that increased thermic effect of food. And then, as Aidan mentioned, there are actually some quite niche specifics as well.
Yeah, even on the topic of the protein and fiber and stuff like that, they'll increase the thermic effect of food. Another underrated one that absolutely is not related to metabolism, but I still think it indirectly helps, is if you have a higher intake of minimally processed foods versus processed, the amount of calories required in digesting, which is kind of thermic effect food, like will increase a bit, but also the amount of calories we absorb will decrease a little bit. Not a huge thing, but if you took somebody who's eating mostly processed foods to mostly minimally processed food, you would see a swing of like 100 or 200 calories in that direction, which is even more than the novel strategies I'm going to talk about now, which is talking about research on, and I've included this in the show notes as well, but like research on capsaicin, caffeine, and green tea. With capsaicin, which is found in chili, like supplementation of that, there are modest increases of about 50 calories per day when it's consumed regularly. With caffeine, you get somebody who's not having caffeine to having a fair bit of caffeine, and you'll see another small increase of around 50 calories per day. Regular usage probably decreases that a little bit. And then green tea extract, similarly, another like 50. Some of these, there's research showing like 50 to 150. I had an interesting chat with Tyler on our team a while back where he'd kind of like gone through this research and he's like, hang on, there's like a lot of dietitians who are ripping on like fat burners and stuff like that, saying that they do not work at all, but they will have ingredients like this. And like, you just having a supplement that increases your energy expenditure by like 150 calories. Like, why is that a bad thing? I personally think that it's worth knowing that there are some novel things like this that can increase it. But does it also matter? Like, there's a few things. Like, one is that I think if you did this every day for an extended period of time, the benefits would reduce. And then two, I also think that our appetite adjusts based on our energy expenditure. If you did something that increased your energy expenditure by 150 calories, I'm not saying your appetite would increase by exactly 150 calories, but I do think over time it would balance out a little bit, even just through the nature of if you do anything that puts you in a calorie deficit for an extended period of time, typically you become hungrier. It's just a bit of a defense mechanism. Otherwise, you could waste away to nothing. So these things exist. I don't go out of my way to recommend them for that.
No, neither do I.
And like on the topic of caffeine, I can't imagine going very high caffeine specifically just for this if you didn't otherwise want to go that high caffeine.
Should we have a chat about some other contributors then? Because obviously food is one aspect of it, but we also know things like muscle mass, genetics, your level of fidgeting or general activity or exercise, as well as your age and gender can all influence that resting metabolic rate.
Did you get any interesting research on this? Like, I know we spoke about it off air. Like,
not a whole lot. I'd love to hear what you've got to say though.
Yeah, so I looked into research as well because obviously genetics do matter here. It's hard to say how much, particularly because there's a lot of moving parts, and I think it would matter even more just beyond metabolism in terms of like how much people will naturally want to eat and stuff like that. But going specific to total daily energy expenditure, a loose estimate from what I've seen in the research is that even after accounting for variables like fat-free mass and other common things that we typically put into a formula, there is still often as much as a 200 to 300 calorie difference in RMR between people that seems to be largely influenced by genetics. That's not like massive. Like, it's not like if somebody's like, oh, I have a super fast metabolism and it's like a huge difference. But it is also a meaningful one. Like, it does make a difference as well. And then the numbers definitely get larger. Hard to quantify, but they definitely get larger when we go broader and include things like incidental movement, like the fidgeting and stuff.
Which I think is a big one that people underestimate potentially. And would you put fidgeting in that non-exercise? Yeah,
absolutely.
Me too. And when you see clients who are fidgeters or you ask questions around that, you naturally do see that they have a much higher maybe energy requirement or energy expenditure generally as well, because it can make a big difference.
Yeah, it absolutely does. Like, this is not exactly in the same space, but I think about this a lot. So research on people with Parkinson's, because there's often heaps of shaking, their energy expenditure is so much higher. And that, when you bring it back to just like natural, normal fidgeting, if you compared somebody who's just a very still person to somebody who's just constantly fidgeting away, it does add up. It makes a big difference.
If we look at a few more practical recommendations then, definitely, obviously, increasing exercise makes sense. Increasing muscle mass also can make a difference, especially because muscle tissue does require more energy generally for maintenance compared to, body fat and things like that. So that's something that does make a difference. What do you recommend in that aspect there, Aidan?
On the muscle mass thing, that actually brings me back to something I kind of missed with the bariatric surgery thing where there was like this increase I talked about. I don't think it was actually a quote unquote random increase. I think it was just that because they lost such a large percentage of fat in relation to muscle, that when they redid things based on the formula, it was a bit more favorable because muscle burns more calories than fat. I don't know how practical in many cases the muscle thing is, because it's very hard to build muscle. It's like the effort that you put into this is often harder than the benefit you get from the metabolism perspective. But I think everybody should be putting effort in that space anyway. Other practical things, if I was going to summarize a lot of the thoughts we've already had, is like, I don't think you should be striving to be in a deficit year round. I think spending time out of a deficit makes sense. I think having a good baseline of general movement wherever possible, even though that's not technically like in the RMI category, I think it just gives you a bigger calorie budget, which makes it easier to eat slightly more food. And I think the mostly minimally processed diet thing, because you're naturally going to take care of a few things if you try to do that, such as fiber and protein, and indirectly you start adding all of those things up and there's like hundreds of calories that go into your energy expenditure through all of this.
Which makes a huge difference. Absolutely. Was there anything else that you wanted to add?
That covers everything from me.
Amazing. Well, this has been episode 226 of the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love if you could leave a positive review, and we will be back next week.